The feminization of black slaves and the right to wear pants on the southern plantations. When you observe the behavior of some characters in some comedy shows and movies, no one doubts that the feminization of the man is something that makes the viewers laugh, especially when we talk about some comic actors like Martin Lawrence, Eddie Murphy, Arsenio Hall, Taye Diggs and serious like Wesley Snipes. No one doubts that some may question the masculinity of the black man when glued to the television screen, and we laugh at the jokes of these black men acting like women. We all know that we are looking at a simple representation of a character in a television comedy. We don't take it very seriously. Although we must admit that for the millions of children and adolescent males this character can be seen as real, and more so when they are represented by heterosexual black men, who project masculine energy in daily life, when he's out of character. For some male adolescents the line between fantasy and reality is still not well defined, and these characters can create confusion when we talk about the role of a man. Nobody doubts that this feminine behavior, mannerism, style or gender roles of the black male in many television sitcoms reinforces the debate on social media after being seen to endorse the argument that there is an ongoing feminization of black men in the media. But this type of work, it is not focused on that type of feminization and emasculation of African American men, which is not the product of the lack of power during the slave system, which is still part of the collective mentality of some black men. From the biological, social and historical point of view, there is a great difference between feminization and emasculation of men. Biological feminization is the process through which a transfeminine person makes their face and body more feminine through hormone therapy or gender-affirming surgery, contrary to the social feminization which we will focus on in this work. This is where we must analyze the origin of the feminization of the image of black men and the masculinization of black women, which goes beyond a simple television character. We must see this phenomenon from a historical context, where the influence of the slave system still controls the way blacks see themselves and the role they should play. Some scholars of human behavior associate the social feminization of the black man with the emasculation of the black male image, in which they feel essentially powerless. The emasculated man may feel both embarrassed and ashamed of himself as a man. As a result, he may try desperately to either prove his masculinity to others or to hide the fact that he perceives himself lacking. Something that listeners of this analysis must understand: many black males during slavery, as a result of cultural imposition and loss of tribal identity, also lost the sense of hierarchy, where men occupied a much higher position compared to women. The loss of a sense of hierarchy based on the gender and role of people is something that is partly responsible for the deterioration of the black family in America, which has its origin in the slave system. Many males don't know what it means to be a man. At the same time, many females don't understand what it means to be a woman. Right now, the black man can compete with another black man for the attention of a woman because racially and socially they are considered equal. During the slave system, in which the owners of slaves were the ones who controlled the lives of black slaves, competing for the attention of a black woman had a very different meaning because both were seen as simple property. Another aspect to consider was that the black slaves who presented some type of behavior considered defiant, undisciplined, and aggressive were the ones who suffered the most from the punishment at the hands of the slave owners. Apart from whipping their backs, genital castration was one of the punishments sometimes used to control the behavior of aggressive slaves. This is where black slaves learned to suppress masculinity as a survival mechanism. Something that we must understand: the enormous psychological importance in a Western society where there is a clear difference in behavior, social roles, clothing style and type of work which are associated with different genders. This is where wearing a dress is a sign of femininity and wearing pants is a sign of masculinity. Something that black slaves and slave owners understood the meaning associated with the style of clothing that people wear, which defines the identity of both males and females in social terms of gender. The black slaves to impress a woman must wear pants as synonymous with masculinity, and women wear dresses as synonymous with femininity. When you analyze the behavior of black slaves, no one doubts that feminization was part of the psychological terrorism used by slave owners. As a way to control the masculinity of the slaves, many slave owners used the use or not of pants as a symbol of lack of masculinity in slave male, from childhood to adulthood. How does this psychological manipulation affect the femininity and masculinity of black slaves? It is a topic that we must analyze from a historical perspective to understand why some black men present behavior considered feminine and masculine in the case of women. I think it's a complex narrative to unpack, but it ultimately dates back to slavery. A time when the most prized possession the oppressed black man had was his masculinity. For that very reason, being a man became the central expectation of the black male experience. Namely, being uniform in their hardness, lack of emotional expression, and rampant sexuality, but also growing up without the support of a masculine figure from which to learn what it really means to be a man, and project in behavior that masculine energy that every man is supposed to have. When you see old photos of your relatives hanging from trees and you know that your women were raped and you were sold to the highest bidder, and you see the history of America, how you were exploited, you can't help but to feel some kind of way. Some people think the fact that we made something out of nothing, that we are all right. Nothing can be farther from the truth. While understandable in its rooting, the effects of this have been plentiful. Systematic racism remains a real problem. But so too is the limited incarnations of allowed black masculinity. Black men are oftentimes not permitted, by their own culture, to show sensitivity, empathy, or weakness, which has its origin in the slave system. The effects of psychological terrorism on slaveholders continue to inspire intense debate. It should be useful for scholars to focus on the severity in which slaves were mentally tortured. Perhaps one of the most innovatively cruel strategies of slave owners concerned the ways they tried to castrate boys, and completely enslaved men by denying them the right to wear pants. By forcing African American boys and men to wear similar dress shirts, slave owners attempted to feminize and humiliate male slaves on a daily basis. According to the results of interviews with freed slaves, denying black children and youth the right to wear pants was a relatively widespread practice throughout the Deep South of the United States. This custom certainly becomes even more interesting when slaveholders' beliefs about slave breeding and the virility of young bucks is taken into consideration. Countless owners commented time and again in diaries and letters about the supposedly highly sexualized nature of young black men, and the emasculation of the enslaved must have allowed slaveholders some type of psychosexual superiority complex. By feminizing African American males, slave owners likely reassured themselves that they were the most masculine men on the plantation, which could be demonstrated, of course, by the rape and sexual abuse of enslaved women and girls. For African American men, this feminizing message, slave owners probably left each other with the assurance that they, slave owners, were the most masculine men on the plantation, which could of course be demonstrated by rape and the sexual abuse of slave women and girls. Boys wore a one-piece garment not unlike a slightly elongated dress. This was held in place by a string tied around the waist. Another Georgian similarly described, stating that the only little cotton shirt was what all the kids wore in the summer. Well, it ain't worth it. They called it a shirt, but it looked more like a long-tailed nightgown to me, as told by Ed McCree. Summertime for us, the children wore shirts of what looked like nightgowns. You just pulled one of these slips over your head and it was the kind of clothing you wore for the entire week, day and night. Unsurprisingly, the practice of withholding pants seemed to occur commonly on large plantations, where the concentrated number of slaves required constant surveillance and discipline. Some of the enslaved were not even allowed pants during the freezing winters. Charlie Hudson explained that in winter time they give children new cotton and wool mixed shirts what come down to their ankles. By the time hot weather come, the shirt was done wore thin and shrunk up, and besides that, we grew enough for them to be short on us, so we just wore them same shirts right on through the summer. Still, regardless of whether or not enslaved boys received winter pants, they realized that there was no gendered difference in the clothes. As Will Sheets put it, gals and boys was dressed in the same way when they was little chaps. Perhaps the most psychologically damning aspect of denying boys and young men pants was the age at which they were finally granted the garment. During the mid-19th century, children matured very early, and boys were often drinking alcohol and becoming sexually active as young teenagers. It seems that many slaveholders withheld the privilege of wearing pants well past the point that boys were acting like young men, courting girls and trying to establish their masculine identity. However, not all male slaves were lucky enough to receive the pants when the weather turned colder. Harrison Beckett pointed out the precariousness of the situation. The way they dress black boys, they give us a shirt whatever comes down between the knees and the ankles. When the weather was too cold, sometimes they gave us the pants. Something you should know, most of this analysis of this video is concentrated on the article, Men Without Pants, Masculinity and the Enslaved by Carrie Lee Merritt is a historian of the 19th century American South, who works as an independent scholar in Atlanta who deserves all the credit associated with this work. At the bottom of this video I will leave the link so that you can see her work and conclusions. More troubling still were all the stories that young black men were forced to wear sleeve dresses until they were fully grown. Children from 5 to 15 years of age, who used long shirts of this type of fabric. The long-term psychological effects wrought by denying these men pants may never be fully known. No doubt the embarrassment and humiliation caused many of the enslaved untold worries over masculinity and identity. Yet at least in some cases, African American males did not allow their deprivations to temper their activities. To understand the origin of emotional problems, low self-esteem, the feminization of black men, lack of enthusiasm and great mental problems, we must analyze how the mistreatment or dehumanization during slavery, mental terrorism against blacks denying them the right to wear pants, rape of black women by slave owners, lack of hope, Jim Crow enforcement, racial segregation, lynching of blacks people, and institutional racism affect the behavior of African Americans in the United States. From my point of view, in order to find a solution to these problems, we must begin by understanding the mental and behavioral problems that affect blacks. You could learn a little about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is defined by DeGruy, 2005, as a condition that exists when a population has experienced multigenerational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. Why do many black comedians use the feminization of characters in comedy as their main resource to make the audience laugh? Knowing the negative effects of racism and how it controls black minds right now could be a starting point. What is behind this feminine energy that some men project? What is the origin of this feminine energy that many black women possess and defend? Analyzing the feminization of black men by slave owners during slavery, you could find part of the answer in which the right to wear pants was more effective mental terrorism denying males the right to project masculinity. Ladies and gentlemen, if you liked this work, please subscribe to this channel and leave your comments. But above all, give it a like, as a way to promote this type of work to a much wider public.